So if you're not aware already, we have a Spider-Man in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in Tom Holland. This deal was reached after The Amazing Spider-Man 2 bombed at the box office, and Sony had to work in collaboration with Marvel Studios to 1. Save the Spider-Man name and franchise after its slight decline with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, not just in story and quality but in money, and 2. To win over the fans again after the overstuffed TASM 2. And then when Captain America Civil War came around, we saw the introduction of the Wall Crawler on Team Iron Man, and now we have Tom Holland Spider-Man as one of the leading forces for Marvel Phase 4 and going forward. But what if this wasn't the case? What if Andrew Garfield was the one in the MCU, and not Tom Holland? What if Andrew was brought in after The Amazing Spider-Man 2? I mean, they originally planned to have the Oscorp Tower from The Amazing Spider-Man 1 be in the background of the Avengers movie, which would have been a cool little reference to the web films. But let's say the original scenario played out. Let's say The Amazing Spider-Man bombed and Sony needed an exit plan, something that would get them out of the financial mess which was The Amazing Spider-Man 2. But instead of completely ditching The Amazing Spider-Man franchise, they still want to carry on with it. They want to finish what they started, and Avi Arad wants his Sinister Six movie. So what happens? Marvel and Sony come to a deal that Andrew's Spider-Man gets to enter the MCU, and the Amazing Spider-Man films are now attached to the MCU timeline and become a part of that continuity. Now I will admit, this comes with a lot of problems already, like the fact that part of the Marvel-Sony deal originally probably was to have the recasted Spider-Man if Sony wanted him in the MCU. This is because, and no offenses to Andrew here, but if the fans and critics alike saw the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man in an MCU movie, TASM 2 would bring the bad taste from the Garfield movies into the MCU, and Marvel and Kevin Feige probably didn't want that bad reputation. Now, with that being said, the rest of the problems are just story-based, like the fact that Andrew is way too old to join the MCU, and how did the Avengers not know about the Lizard or Electro, etc. However, that's the challenge today. If Andrew was want to join the MCU instead of Tom Holland, then how would it have been done? Well, let's find out. So in this scenario, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 just happened and it's flopped. Sony need an exit strategy, they have to save money and the Spider-Man name. Luckily for them, this is the best time they could have messed up, because just as the film flopped, another movie was currently in production, Avengers Age of Ultron. Sony call Marvel up and they tell them that they need to save Spider-Man and need to reach a deal. Sony ask Marvel if they can throw Andrew into Age of Ultron so fans see him with these other Marvel characters, and it might revive the name so they can move forward with Andrew in the MCU, and they carry on making solo Amazing Spider-Man films. Marvel see the potential in this, and that a character like Spider-Man could elevate the films financially if they collaborated. They both oblige, however there are some strings attached. Marvel now have full creative control over the Spider-Man films, and they will be funded by Sony and will be hosted inside the MCU with Sony's own Andrew Garfield. However, there is another string attached to that from Sony's end too. One of their films will have to feature the Sinister Six in some capacity. Marvel agree, and now Andrew Garfield is a part of the MCU. The final deal is that Marvel is allowed to put Andrew Garfield in any team-up movie in the MCU they'd like, whilst also producing and overseeing 2 solo Spider-Man films inside the MCU, and Sony are allowed to make 1 Spider-Man related film that may or may not connect to the MCU. This will allow Sony to get what they want, financially restabilize Spider-Man, and also create their Sinister Six and Venom film, and also have the Amazing Spider-Man 3 set in the MCU. But before we move forward with the story, we have to explain the big events that have happened across both films, and explain them away into the MCU. The way we'll have this happen is the Amazing Spider-Man 1 take place just before Avengers 1. This way, not much will be known about the event, and it also will be overshadowed by the Avengers and Loki battle, which most people will consider them a part of the same tragedy. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 will take place just a year later in 2013, along the same time that Iron Man 3 did. This is the period in the MCU timeline where New York is left alone for a while. And I think the only big problem here is that someone like Electro would most certainly be on Tony Stark's radar. However, this is just one of the problems that will have to blow off as something that just has to be. We could say that Tony was so busy with the Mandarin and worrying so much about other alien invasions that he was too busy to even care about Electro, who was like a done day thing anyway. Cap was off with missions with S.H.I.E.L.D. along with Black Widow, Thor was off doing the Dark World stuff, Hawkeye was with his family, and Bruce didn't want to be the Hulk anyway, so there we go. We have the Amazing Spider-Man films integrated into the MCU. MCU Phase 1 now goes Iron Man, Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2, Thor, Captain America the First Avenger, The Amazing Spider-Man, The Avengers. MCU Phase 2 now goes Iron Man 3, Thor the Dark World, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Guardians of the Galaxy, Captain America the Winter Soldier, Avengers Age of Ultron, and Ant-Man. Which brings me onto the next part of the story. Avengers Age of Ultron. This is where we introduce Spider-Man into the Avengers, except we're not going to actually be introducing him. He's going to be a reference in this film for the Civil War storyline. You see, if this deal happens in 2014, it's a little too late in the game to throw him in there with any real significance. So instead, there'll be a scene just before the final battle where Tony and Cap are discussing that they're going to need help. Tony suggests creating Vision, and obviously Cap and some others disagree, just like in the real film. Cap suggests a kid called Spider-Man. Whilst the other Avengers were off doing other things, Cap read up on the Electro incident in New York and saw that Spider-Man was one at the helm of it. He suggests bringing him in, however Tony disagrees, saying that he's just a kid. Then the movie plays out the same from there, with the Avengers beating Ultron. Now let's skip on to the next part of the story, the Civil War. Civil War comes around and the story plays out the exact same, except Spider-Man, now he's already established and will play a bigger role. Before, he was just thrown in to be another member of Tony's team, but this time there will be a conflict. Spider-Man is a little bit older in this variation, and we already have had the whole thing about him wearing a mask in the first movie, which will play heavily into this one. In the scene with General Ross explaining the destruction caused over the past couple of years, the Electro incident will also be a part of it. Spider-Man would be directly blamed for it, and the people start to turn against him. Spider-Man will meet with the Avengers and they will introduce themselves to each other. Tony, still like in the real movie, says that they should turn themselves in to work with the government, but obviously Cap disagrees. This goes deeper than just working for the government. Tony talks to Spider-Man and explains to him that much more people will get hurt if they carry on doing what they're doing. Spider-Man tells him that he agrees and the people's safety is what matters to him the most. So Spider-Man is Team Tony. Then we have the whole scene of Cap and Bucky being chased by Black Panther, except for this time Spider-Man will be there as well, and you could throw in maybe a funny introductory scene between T'Challa and Spidey. They take them down. The movie will play out the same from here, except Spider-Man will be in the background of some shots. Then we will get a special scene where Peter visits Gwen's grave, and he is conflicted, really adding depth to his character in this movie and really integrating him into the MCU. He will explain that he doesn't know what to do. If he does the right thing and sides with Tony, he will have to reveal his identity. And that plays also into the reason why Gwen died in the first place, because someone knew who Peter was. So this does play with Peter. Does he save a bunch more people but then loses the ones he loves? Or does he save the ones he loves and then potentially lose a bunch more people? Then none other than Steve Rogers will appear behind him. This is going to be the point in the movie where Cap has escaped just after Sharon had given their stuff. Instead of fighting him, Peter explains that he didn't even want to be a part of this. Peter will also question how Cap found out his secret identity, and Cap says because he knows some guys who used to work at S.H.I.E.L.D. Cap uses this as a gateway by explaining that many more people will know who you are, and the people who love you will get hurt if you reveal who you are. Peter explains to Cap that's the reason why he lost Gwen, because of who he was under the mask. You see him visiting Gwen's grave here really fits into the whole identity thing. Cap will use this to level with Peter and understand his pain. These two characters really connect here. Which contrasts to the real MCU because obviously, as we know, Tony is the one that has that deep understanding with Peter Parker, but here it is Captain America, also with it slightly being Tony as well because he sided with him at the start of the movie, putting Spider-Man in alignment and understanding where both characters are coming from. Spider-Man acts as the middle ground. This scene really explains to us as an audience why the identity is so important to Peter Parker, and this really digs into his character as well. Cap explains he's always saw potential in him to become a real Avenger. Cap explains also that real Avengers don't shy away from the real problem, and Peter asks what that is. Cap explains how the situation with him, Bucky, and Siberia goes a lot deeper with the whole Zemo connection. Peter explains that that's the right thing to do to stop Zemo, to stop this whole conflict, because it isn't right. And he's the one behind all of this. Not Tony, not the government, it's him. Peter switches sides and tries to understand with Tony and tries to get him to understand what they mean by this and what is actually going on, but Tony is too struck on the fact that Ultron caused all that damage and he just needs to save people by working with the government. Then the movie plays out the exact same, except Spider-Man is already in there, and then obviously we have the whole airport fight, Team Cap versus Team Tony, and then we have the Cap and Bucky fight with Iron Man at the end. The rest of the movie plays out the same, and that is it. That is Peter's real first introduction into these characters. Civil War has just ended, and Cap and Tony have gone their separate ways after the reveal that Bucky killed Tony's parents. Tony carries on as normal, and Cap goes to Wakanda with T'Challa, and Spider-Man is left out in New York. This is when we lead straight into The Amazing Spider-Man 3, which will be released in 2017, just like when Spider-Man Homecoming was released in the real MCU. Civil War did deal with some of the ramifications of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 in that we had a scene where Cap and Peter discussed Gwen's death. However, this film will expand on this idea and explain Peter's character development more. Now, I must specify that this series of videos is not connected to my Amazing Spider-Man continuation that I already have done on this channel. This will explore what if TASM 3 happened inside of the MCU, and with that being said, let's get straight into it. This film will very much follow the vibe of the previous Amazing Spider-Man films, however the MCU edition will very much be present to this film as Marvel now oversees this film. The movie will start with Peter and him reacting to the events of Captain America Civil War. Obviously, now that he is in the MCU and he's helped Team Cap, he's currently a fugitive and is on the run. Peter will be dragged down by this, and his arc in this film will be to fight for the right thing, even if it means no one else agrees with him, which was set perfectly from Civil War. This will be metaphorically expressed through the film's opening when Spider-Man will go out to stop a crime, and he will be booed on the street. He will stop the thugs, but people will be scared of him. It turns out that the reason the hate is so strong is because none other than J. Jonah Jameson is forwarding the hate train on Spider-Man after the Civil War incident. He is praising Team Iron Man for siding with the government, but is hating on Team Cap, who are now criminals. This is where the hate for Spider-Man will come when JJ is concerned. The reason that he thinks he is a menace in this universe is because of Civil War, which makes perfect sense as the public only see the surface level details in which the public were exposed to the fact that Team Cap were criminals and should be arrested. Due to this, the police show up at the scene when Spider-Man stops some thugs. Spider-Man escapes and returns to Aunt May. We then have a scene where Peter and Aunt May catch up with each other and they talk about Gwen's death, and this is a really emotional scene. We will then get introduced to the main villain of the film, which is Kraven. He gets a call from his half-brother, whose name is Dimitri, and he tells them that they have a job offer in New York. There is a handsome reward for killing the current fugitive, known as Spider-Man. Now, Dimitri will be like the second villain kind of, but won't play as big as a role as Kraven here. He'll be more in the background, while Kraven will be more forefront. Kraven works as a perfect antagonist as Spider-Man is currently hated by the public, giving the city someone to root for. There will also be a scene explaining what Kraven does and that he hunts animals for a living in Africa. We will also be introduced to Kraven's wife, Calypso, as this then raises the stakes for Kraven's character. We then cut back to Peter as Aunt May says that Anna Watson is back in town and that her niece is with her, Mary Jane Watson. Now, MJ was originally meant to be in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but was actually cut from that film because there were way too many characters, and she was instead going to be introduced in The Amazing Spider-Man 3, so that's what we're doing here. So that's where the MCU will also take this by introducing MJ, and it gives us a chance to reintroduce their own love interest and really establish that this is a franchise that is now being taken in a different direction, and these films are now connected to the MCU, are now overseen by Marvel Studios. It's almost a rebirth of the Spider-Man franchise. Peter is introduced to MJ in a very awkward scene that almost showing the campiness nature and unconfident nature of Peter at this point. After Gwen's death, Peter has regressed as a character, so this makes sense, and over the next couple of films, solo or not, it's all about building up his confidence again to how he was in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. He has to reconnect and win the trust of the city back after Civil War, but also has to reconnect with the confidence within himself. This also acts as a soft reboot for the character, as Marvel have now regressed him and can build him back up and better. This time, Andrew's Spider-Man will still be the same character, but this scene will explore more of a comic book side of Peter's character, almost acting on what Marvel originally did with Tom Holland, but it's still Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. The movie will continue with these sorts of scenes and Peter becoming self-aware of the problem at hand. He decides that he needs to prove himself to the public, and he needs to win the trust of everyone back. This will result in a compilation of scenes where Peter goes around trying too hard as Spider-Man and ends up messing up multiple times. This will knock his confidence on both sides of the character. Peter will be in the dumps because of this, that he is always messing up. He will be with Mary Jane, and MJ will notice that something is up with Peter. Peter will open up to her, but not fully, and he won't admit that he is Spider-Man, but will word it in a way that makes his identity not obvious. This will allow MJ and Peter to connect emotionally and really give these two a believable relationship. Then one day when Spider-Man is out on a swing, Kraven will attack him. Kraven and Spider-Man will fight and brawl. Spider-Man will start questioning where he even came from and who even is he? And Kraven will state that he's here to kill and eliminate Spider-Man from this world. In the fight, Kraven and Spider-Man cause a lot of property damage, showing the jumpy and unconfident nature of Peter's regressed character. However, Peter still manages to barely beat Kraven. Authorities arrive with special force and Peter begs them to hear him out and that Peter was simply just using self-defense against Kraven, but they're having none of it as they still try and take him down and Spider-Man escapes. We then have a scene where Peter remembers George Stacy and that he would never want this. Maybe if George Stacy was still here, he could convince the authorities to stand down and be a bigger role in this Registration Act business. Spider-Man remembers, and this is a cool little callback to the Amazing Spider-Man 1 here as well. We then have a scene with none other than General Thunderbolt Ross and Tony Stark. Ross says to Stark that this Spider-Man guy who helped Cap is still out there and is causing a lot of havoc. Tony agrees and says that he knows him. Tony says that he's a good kid, but then Ross says that they have to bring him in for the safety of the public and the laws because of the Registration Act. Tony agrees, so they both agree to bring him in the next time he shows his face. Now remember, you might be wondering, but doesn't Tony already know who he is? Well, no. Captain America Steve Rogers is the only one who knows who Spider-Man is. You see, with Andrew as a more mature Peter Parker in Civil War, that will allow that film to revolve around identity a bit more, thus elevating the stakes for heroes like Spider-Man who have an identity. Peter, as explained in the Gwen Stacy grave scene in Civil War, will not reveal his identity. The only reason Cap will know his identity is because he knew some old S.H.I.E.L.D. ops who were brought in by Nick Fury to do research on superheroes and superpowered beings. Cap dug a little deeper and found it was Peter Parker. Tony Stark and General Ross will not have this information as Peter keeps his identity very close to him. However, it isn't over yet as Dimitri is determined to kill Spider-Man for that paycheck. He has set charges inside of a building and his plan is to lead Spider-Man into that building by using civilian hostages and then blowing it all to smithereens. But he needs him distracted. He needs the suspicions to be away from him. So he decides with his tech to break Kraven out of jail to help take down Spider-Man. Kraven is pissed. Kraven isn't just mad that he was put away, but Spider-Man has ruined his dignity. No prey has ever beaten Sergei Kravinoff. He wants his revenge. He has his scent from their last battle. It's personal to Kraven now, and the hunt is on. We then get a scene with Peter and MJ. They are out walking down the street and they ask each other how they are and they're really hitting it off. They're really good friends at this point in the story. All the Spider-Man stuff is getting to Peter and he really needs someone to tell. He wants to tell MJ but he can't because he knows the consequences of revealing his identity. Then none other than Kraven track him down again, but this time as Peter Parker. Kraven exclaims that he knows he is Spider-Man and mocks him and MJ. This is a public place, so Peter has to get her out of here. MJ doesn't exactly believe what's going on right now and is kind of in a state of shock, so she won't really pay attention to Kraven saying that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. He tells MJ to run, but she is stopped in her tracks by Kraven. Kraven takes her away and tells him to follow or she will die along with a bunch of other people. Peter is pissed. At first he thinks that his identity has got out and that's why Kraven knows who he is. Of course he is wrong, but many possibilities are running through his head right now. But Peter knows. He puts down the mask and decides this is it. He has to end this. Spider-Man swings into action. Finally, the epic Amazing Spider-Man score is fueling the scene in the background as he chases Kraven down. But then he's stopped. He's stopped by military forces. Spider-Man is surrounded and it's General Thunderbolt Ross. He says that Spider-Man must hand himself over to the government and that he is breaking Federation laws. Spider-Man is shouting at them and the real problem is getting away with the hostages. He takes out a few of the soldiers, but then Iron Man lands in and shouts that that is enough. Iron Man looks at him and says he needs to stop. Spider-Man explains the situation to Tony. And what's good about this is that Spider-Man tried to do the exact same thing in Civil War and tried to explain the bigger picture to Tony, but he wouldn't listen. Spider-Man uses this as an example, obviously, as Tony knows what was going on in Siberia now after the events of Civil War. And Tony comes full circle. Tony completes his small little character arc set up by Civil War into this movie. He has learned that you have to break the rules to sometimes do the right thing. And this time, Tony has learned. And he knows that now, this is taking down Kraven. Tony agrees and Iron Man distracts the military soldiers as Spider-Man swings away. These two are now friends. The score kicks in again and Spider-Man tracks Kraven to a building with 5 hostages and MJ being one of them. Dimitri then reveals himself saying that he has a little surprise for Spider-Man, and it's all revealed to Spider-Man that he is the one behind all of this. Kraven and his escape from jail, MJ's kidnapping, everything. Kraven exclaims that he's just a reckless, scared kid. Peter knows this is his judgment day. He knows he can't mess up this time. Kraven and Spider-Man fight in the building. Kraven is trying to keep him as distracted as possible before the bomb blows up. Spider-Man doesn't know this at this point though. Spider-Man and Kraven brawl, and this time Spider-Man has had enough, but the fight is tough, and in the midst of it, Peter gets his mask ripped off of him, and MJ sees it's Peter behind the mask. Peter beats Kraven and starts to get the civilians out of there. He drops MJ to the ground and says that he'll explain later. She is shocked and in disbelief that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. However, Peter still has to deal with Dimitri. He goes back inside and Dimitri is standing there saying he is too late. Peter asks what he means by that, and then Dimitri jumps out of the window and the bomb blows up with Peter inside. As far as Dimitri knows, he has won. He won. He beat Spider-Man, but it doesn't kill him because he's Spider-Man and he has spider powers, but it severely injures him. And that is it. Dimitri escapes, and Spider-Man won, but also lost. There is something to learn here, and this also does ground Spider-Man's character. It doesn't make him overly powerful, it doesn't make him as powerful or OP as the Avengers. This really does show us that Spider-Man really is only the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and he still has a lot to learn in comparison to our fellow Avengers. We then get a scene at the end of the movie once Kraven is in jail and all is said and done, with Tony and Spider-Man. Spider-Man has saved the day, saved the civilians, he'd won back the trust of the city, but he's still reckless, and the building was still blown up. This is like the Civil War scene where Captain America and Scarlet Witch accidentally blow up the building, and then obviously causing the Registration Act. But instead, no one died this time. It's a step in the right direction. Tony says that he sees something in Spider-Man, and he doesn't want to stop him because he can really see him becoming the best out of all the Avengers one day. But he must be more careful. Spider-Man breaks down to Tony and takes off his mask, and he reveals that he's Peter Parker. Tony sympathizes with him as he's only a kid. This then sets up his arc for the next movies to come, and also sets up this relationship with Tony Stark, which I thought was lacking in the Civil War story. Spider-Man not only has now a relationship with Tony Stark, just like in the real MCU, but also has one with Captain America as well, really making Spider-Man the middle ground. We then get a scene with Dimitri and the Gentleman from The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2. He explains that he failed him, but he has other plans to bring down Spider-Man once and for all, and explains that something more sinister is coming. In Infinity War, the movie will almost play out the exact same. You could almost take Tom out and place Andrew in there. So at the start of the movie, Thanos will take down Thor, Loki, and the Hulk, and then Heimdall will send the Hulk to Earth where he informs Doctor Strange and Wong about the situation. Ebony Maw arrives to Earth and Tony Stark is on the scene. Peter gets a small scene with MJ similar to the Tony and Pepper scene. Peter is explaining him as Spider-Man and everything that happened with Gwen, and explains that he can't have it happen again. He must learn from his mistakes and never make that one again. He explains to MJ that it's always the people before himself, which is his #1 policy. After everything that has happened to this Spider-Man, if saving someone else's life is how he dies, then he's fulfilled his destiny and took responsibility. Then a ship comes down and Peter swings off as MJ watches him confront Thanos' children. He arrives and interacts with Doctor Strange and Tony Stark. The movie plays out the exact same from here, except Tony is a little bit more for Peter to come help them this time, as he isn't as young as Tom Holland was. The whole "you're an Avenger now" scene doesn't actually happen, as Tony already kind of sees the Spider-Man as an Avenger. He was a crucial part in the Civil War storyline for both sides. He's been around for longer, he fought Elektra and the Lizard, and the list goes on. He's more experienced. This Spider-Man is way more experienced than Tom's was, even though he has still a lot to learn. The movie goes on and Cap's side of the story happens as normal, as so does Tony's, and then we get to the Titan battle. Thanos arrives and they all try and take him down. Now this part just plays out the exact same. Thanos wins and takes the Time Stone from Strange, and everyone is left in shock. You could literally just put Andrew in for Tom in this scene. Thanos goes to Wakanda, kills Vision, and takes the Mind Stone and snaps his fingers. So people start being snapped away. Peter Quill dies, Drax dies, Mantis dies, Strange dies, but Peter Parker does not. Peter lives, and this instantly dwells a lot on Peter. Now this is the main difference between this Infinity War and the one with Tom Holland in it. So this one, Peter will dwell on the fact that he isn't dead, and trust me, this is good for his character. I'm not just adding this in here because I don't want Spider-Man to not die. In this scenario, he would be sacrificing himself for half of the entire universe, and he failed. Not only did he fail to stop Thanos with the rest of Avengers, but he didn't make the sacrifice play. He let it happen. A villain got the best of him again. And now, this is cyclical because at the start of the movie, he was telling MJ how he wanted to make the sacrifice play. He wanted to sacrifice himself before anyone else. And he didn't get to do that. He didn't get to fulfill that destiny. He didn't get to fulfill that responsibility. and this will dwell on Peter's character, which leads us straight into Endgame, which consists of the core Avengers, Captain Marvel, Rocket, Rhodey, and Spider-Man. Throughout this film, Spider-Man will be angry. He's mad that he let it happen again. Rage flows through him. So Tony, Peter, and Nebula will be stuck inside the Guardian ship, and this will be a real bonding session for Peter and Tony. They'll really get to know each other here, as well as Nebula. Captain Marvel will save them, and they all come back to Earth. Tony reunites with Pepper, but here, Peter reunites with no one. MJ isn't there. Peter breaks down. He just cries. MJ had been snapped away by Thanos. He's distraught, sad, lonely. The kid from Queens that can't catch a break. First Gwen, then half the universe, and now MJ. The girl he promised he wouldn't let down like he did with Gwen. Just when it started to become really good for Peter and looked like MJ might have been the one. No. Then the movie plays out relatively the same, with Tony and Cap arguing and them having to devise a plan to go and kill Thanos. However, Peter isn't there like Tony wasn't originally. Peter wouldn't want to go and kill Thanos anyway, as he'd disagree. Despite how angry, upset, and frustrated he is and how much he hates Thanos, Peter's ideals still lie. He wouldn't want Thanos to die. The Avengers kill Thanos anyway and return with no stones. 5 years later, however, Scott Lang returns from the quantum realm, and there is hope. The Avengers meet up with Tony and tell him the news, and Tony doesn't want to, as he's happy now with his new family. He has a kid, Morgan. Then the Avengers discover time travel and it's all said and done. They're going to go get the stones and snap everyone back using the quantum realm. The Avengers say they're going to need all the help they can get. We cut to Peter, who is with Aunt May. You see, if Peter lost absolutely everything, he would just be the same character as Thor in this movie, so Peter will actually still have Aunt May around, and he will be feeling a little better than he did before. He hasn't had the need to be Spider-Man for a while though. We see Peter has a beard and looks slightly rough, but he's happier than he was at the start of all this. But it's surface level happiness. Peter still feels wronged and dread deep down inside that he lost half the universe, that he lost MJ. We have a scene where Steve pulls up at Peter's house, and the first time that Steve has seen Peter since the grave scene in Civil War, so these two characters really do connect with each other when they do see each other. And he simply says, "Hey kid." They have a chat about everything that has happened and that the Avengers need Spider-Man's help one last time. Peter says that he hasn't worn the mask since the incident. Steve says it's up to him, but half the universe depends on them and their friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Peter reluctantly agrees, and it's time. They all have their quantum suit get-ups and all ready. Peter would go with Tony and Cap and Hulk to try and get the Space Stone back, and the movie would play out the exact same, except something will travel back on Rhodey's shoe once they come back from Morag. It'll be in the background, nothing significant, but it'll be a black goo and will hide out in the Avengers base. Anyway, back to the main story. They will successfully get all the stones back and Hulk will snap everyone back into existence. We'll have the epic scene where everyone comes back in the Avengers, the Guardians of the Galaxy, Wakanda, Asgard, and the new Andrew Garfield Spider-Man in the MCU all stand together as they battle Thanos and his army. They come out on top obviously, and just before the end of the movie, when everyone is back to normal and everyone is getting their top off scenes, Peter gets one scene where he sees MJ and just breaks down in her arms. Now here is the thing you may be wondering, wouldn't Peter be 5 years older than her? Well, MJ is actually 2 years older than Peter, so that would only make Peter 3 years older than MJ now. So just before you guys tell me off, there's your answer. Anyway, this scene would pay off for the last two movies where all these characters have been in distraught. But Peter still has that pent-up rage and anger within him, just because of what Thanos did. We have the funeral scene for Tony Stark, and instead of having a scene where Tom Holland was in school when everyone goes back to their normal lives, we have a scene with Andrew's Peter and MJ driving off in a car together into the sunset, but with that mysterious black goo on the back of the number plate, meaning that this character's journey is certainly not over just yet. This movie starts out on a high note from the end of Endgame, but then drops right back down when we're introduced to the main problem that Peter faces in this movie. Peter and all his fears, he's been dealing with a slight PTSD issue. And the Sinister Six in this movie will represent the culmination of the story of Spider-Man and his problems that he's been building up since TASM 2. And it explodes in this film. He has had anxiety and he's afraid. There is a scene with Peter and MJ telling him how he should take a break and he's been feeling really down. Peter said that he's took a break from being Spider-Man before and he realized that he can't give up because of what Uncle Ben said. Then on the news, someone called the Shocker is robbing a store downtown and Peter must go. Spider-Man swings into action and tries to stop the Shocker, but has flashbacks to Endgame and is slightly injured, but then gets back up and beats the Shocker. The Shocker goes to prison. This scene will represent how the whole world depends on Spider-Man now after the death of Tony Stark, and how the weight of the world is now on his shoulders and he suffers from this thought. The gentleman from the previous films then reveals himself. He reveals to be a rival of Tony Stark and that his company was taken down because of Stark and he was outselling everything he was doing. He took a shareholder in Oscorp before Norman died to produce supervillains to draw Iron Man out and destroy Stark's empire as he was jealous of him. This was inspired after the incidents like Lizard, Electro and Goblin, etc. So then created the Rhino using the same Oscorp tech, then hired the Chameleon and now the Shocker. This will then tie in TASM 2 and TASM 1 more into the MCU as these will be the most disconnected films. The main theme and similarity here is that he's always been hindered by one man, Spider-Man. Spider-Man has always been in his way from taking down Stark and accomplishing his goals. So this becomes personal. He hates Spider-Man and has started to use the tech to his advantage. It's revealed that his real name is Roderick Kingsley. But now the legacy of Tony Stark now lives on through heroes like Spider-Man who have stepped up to the big leagues. He has the motivation and it's time for the final battle. Spider-Man versus the Sinister Six. We then have a scene with Peter when he meets an old friend, Eddie Brock, who is back in town. Eddie and Peter catch up. Eddie says that Peter isn't the same man he remembers him to be when they were kids. A conversation here will be had about Peter's parents, since the whole untold story aspect of The Amazing Spider-Man still exists in this universe. This will be a good way to wrap up that story by introducing Eddie Brock, who can put a closure on that part of Peter's life. Peter introduces Eddie to MJ and them three hit it off. They're kind of like Harry, Peter and MJ in the Raimi movies. They're kind of like that trio. When they're all hanging out together, Peter will have some kind of mental breakdown due to the anxiety that he's been dealing with recently, and he doesn't want to be seen as weak, so he runs off. We then get a scene where Peter and MJ talk. MJ says that even though he's having a hard time, he couldn't just ditch like that. Peter says that she doesn't understand what he's been going through. No one does. They fight between each other and then they split off from each other. MJ says whatever they have is over. They are done. From MJ's perspective, all they do is fight. This right here will set up MJ's character arc for this film, which will be that she has to learn to understand other people, especially people like Peter, because what he's been through since Infinity War. We then get a scene where MJ meets up with Eddie and tells him all about it, as them two have become good friends. We get a calm scene where Peter is out in the costume swinging. He lands on a building and just thinks to himself. It's almost a calm before the storm type scene. Peter goes home and sleeps. The symbiote bonds with Peter in his sleep and amplifies his stress and PTSD, and it forms into anger. This is the symbiote from Endgame, by the way, that was attached to Rhodey's shoe. The symbiote will be an embodiment of Peter's anger and hatred that he's been building up. It will act as a representation in this movie. Mary Jane is really upset and Eddie is there to comfort her. Eddie tells her she isn't wrong in thinking this, as Eddie knew Peter as someone entirely different before the snap as well. He doesn't recognize him now. They relate and bond over this, and Eddie and MJ will start to flirt. There's a little bit of a thing going on there. Then back with the gentleman. Himself and Dimitri from The Amazing Spider-Man 3 will have a talk and decide to get the team together. He then plans to break out the villains like Electro, Rhino, Shocker, Dimitri's half-brother Kraven, and of course, Harry Osborn using Oscorp access codes. Them five, along with Dimitri, who has now gone under the name Chameleon, will make up the Sinister Six. He plans to appoint Harry Osborn as the team leader, but there's a catch. We get a little bit of a glimpse at what Harry and the gentleman's relationship is when the gentleman reveals that he is the one that produces some form of cure for Harry that is related to the cure that we saw in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. We then cut back to Peter as Eddie goes to talk to him as he's really upset MJ. And Eddie, now feeling a certain way about MJ, now has developed a little crush and is slightly protective, being the character that Eddie Brock is. He goes to Peter civilly, however, but Peter is having none of it. He argues that no one should treat him this way when they don't know what he's been going through, and because of the symbiote, Peter pushes Eddie up against a wall. Eddie tries to fight back, but Peter floors him. Eddie is older than him, and Peter was always scroungy. He was a kid. He was never be able to do something like this before. Why can he do it now? And Eddie's mad. He storms off, and these two guys' friendship is now over. We then have a similar scene to the Rikers Island breakout in Spider-Man PS4, as the gentleman starts to break out a bunch of inmates as a distraction to break out the villains. Spider-Man goes there and with the help of the symbiote, contains a lot of the inmates. He fights Electro and Kraven, as those are the only ones who don't require suits for their powers. Spider-Man beats Kraven and he escapes whilst he goes after Electro. Electro and Spider-Man fight, and then the gentleman calls them off to go and regroup. Spider-Man with the symbiote is also really overpowered, but he almost kills Kraven in their battle. This is the first glimpse at redemption for Peter as he realizes that this is not who Spider-Man is. He almost has someone in his head telling him to kill him, but he doesn't. After their successful escape, the Gentleman is questioned. Why would any of these guys work together? The Gentleman says that he wants Spider-Man wiped out of the picture as much as everyone else does here. Spider-Man has taken something from everyone there, and everyone has a reason to take him down. They all receive their tech as the Gentleman has ties to Oscorp. We then get a scene with JJJ when he comments on the destruction at Rikers and said that Spider-Man couldn't even stop the big villains from escaping, and that he can never live up to the Tony Stark and Avengers level threats. This fuels Peter's anger even more and regresses him further. This makes Peter realize what he's become though. He reads his phone and he has text from MJ and he's really sad, and MJ's really sad. Peter sends a voicemail to MJ that he's really sorry and that they should meet and talk things over. This is the realization moment for Peter. He realizes how much of a dick he's become and how much the symbiote has influenced him. He fought his childhood best friend. He almost killed Kraven, and he's hurt MJ. We then get a scene where MJ goes to Peter's house to speak with Peter, but he's not there. And Aunt May says that she doesn't know where he is half the time and that he hasn't been home in a while. MJ meets with Eddie Brock again. Eddie says that she shouldn't worry about Peter anymore. She is with a guy that makes her happy. MJ says that Peter was misunderstood though and thinks he was going through something that not many people could comprehend. Eddie says not to try and justify with him that he's a dick. MJ, knowing that he is Spider-Man, knows what he's been through, and MJ now comes to a realization and her arc is complete. She has to level with him instead of fighting with him. Something that Eddie can't understand, and because he has fought Peter physically, he has regressed past that. Eddie storms off and doesn't understand and says that if she's going to linger over Peter, Eddie can't be her second choice. Eddie is blindsided by the real facts here. Granted, he doesn't know that Peter is Spider-Man, but still. Eddie storms off. We then cut to Peter taking off the symbiote as it's not good for him. He is at a church and he bangs it against the bell just like in Spider-Man 3. The symbiote is weak after leaving Peter, which was such a strong host, so much hate for the symbiote to linger off of and amplify. But Peter has learned now he can't let the hate, anger, aggression and all his deep dark emotions consume him, which was represented through the symbiote. The Six have devised their plan. The Gentleman wants to overwhelm Spider-Man and then finally delivering the final blow to seal the deal before taking back what's rightfully his. And since Stark is already dead and out of the picture, and like I said earlier, the legacy of Stark lives on through heroes like Spider-Man, so they are respected by the public and by a notion that Stark once created, that the Avengers have done the world a favor, the universe a favor. But Roderick was never spared. He was thrown under the bus by Stark, and now Spider-Man is the one and only who stands in his way. His plan since the beginning is finally coming to fruition, and Spider-Man has always been the one to stop him. But now it's time. We cut to MJ talking to Peter. Peter apologizes for everything he's done, and MJ explains how she's been so worried about him and that she should have understood what he was going through rather than fighting back. Peter explains how he was a dick and he let it consume him, and then out of nowhere the Daily Bugle reports with J. Jonah Jameson that the supervillains that escaped from Rikers are causing havoc and looking for Spider-Man. Peter knows it. He knows this is it. MJ tells him he can't go because he'll die. There's so many of them. He almost did once in Infinity War. How could he be so lucky again? Peter says he's gotta go. Because there are no more Iron Mans anymore. Tony is dead. Cap is gone. The Avengers don't exist like they used to. The weight of the world and the future of the world hangs on Spider-Man's shoulders, and it's beginning to look more like that ever since the Civil War fallout. It's almost looked like Spider-Man has always been the one to deal with the bigger problems, constantly getting more and more serious. And it's all down to him. With great power comes great responsibility, and Peter wears the red and blue suit as he swings off and he leaves MJ to go and fight his greatest battle yet. Spider-Man in the classic red and blue suit goes off to fight the Sinister Six. He battles Rhino and Shocker first. He webs them down. He beats Rhino by allowing him to charge into a wall. 2 down, 4 to go. Electro is next. Spider-Man knows the plant trick won't work on him a second time, so leads him out to the coast. Spider-Man lands on the water, and when Electro tries to zap him, he makes contact with the water and fries him out. Then a bomb comes his way and blows up in Spider-Man's face. It's the Chameleon. Kraven then runs in and spears Spider-Man, hurting him even more. Kraven says, "You're not so powerful without the black suit, are you, Spidey?" Then they fight, and it's a tough one, but Spider-Man manages to take down Kraven. But Spider-Man is extremely injured. Spider-Man is tired. Then he finally takes down Dimitri and will crack a joke like it's been 5 years or whatever. And then we'll hear the cackle. And Harry Osborn in a classic-looking Green Goblin suit will fly down. This time, Peter is injured and hurt. This fight won't be as easy as it was in TASM 2. But everything lingers off this fight. The death of Gwen Stacy, the entire franchise, every battle that Spider-Man has faced led up to this moment. Another confrontation with Harry Osborn, another confrontation with the Green Goblin. This time Peter is injured and hurt. Harry says how all this, everything that has happened, it's all his fault. It is revealed that the only reason that Harry complied with the gentleman is because he was the one feeding him the cure. He needed the gentleman for his Osborn disease. And that Harry never wanted this to happen, but he needs Spider-Man dead. Which means these two characters come full circle. In TASM 2, Harry needed Peter alive for his blood to stay alive himself, and now in this one, needs him dead to stay alive. They fight one last time. Harry versus Peter, friend versus friend, Goblin versus Spider. It's a brutal fight. They fight to the very end, and Harry Osborn dies, just like Norman Osborn did in The Spectacular Spider-Man. He dies by his own hand due to a mistake by his overwhelming aggression. Peter screams, "No!" But Harry is dead. But at least it's over. The Six is no more. All the villains get taken back to jail and Roderick Kingsley is finally arrested for his crimes. Spider-Man stepped up to the big role. He stepped up like Iron Man would have done, like a true Avenger. He isn't an Avenger, but he's grown up. He isn't a kid from Queens anymore. He's a big-time superhero. He's the world's greatest superhero. We then have a scene to finish off the film with Peter and MJ hugging and crying on each other's shoulder. And cut. Post-credit scene, and Eddie goes to church to find the symbiote. He bonds with it, and Venom is born. This allows for Sony's Venom spin-off movie that they were doing if they were going to continue the Amazing franchise, whilst also it taking place inside of the MCU. But with that being said, that is it for today's video, and that is it for this series. Hopefully you all enjoyed. If you did, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you are new, hit the bell next to the subscribe button to not miss any more content. And with that being said, thank you guys for watching once more, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.